Want to thank the CARP program for funding this project from 2016 to 2019. We did an additional year funded through the CAP program in 2019 just to make sure that the results were reliable. And at the back here, we've got the blue monosem planter. That planter is traditionally used in corn and soybean type approach. So it's not the newest technology. Monosem was actually a French company that was bought by John Deere not all that long ago. And they're working on a field scale version that's targeting Western Canadian acres. There's a number of other manufacturers now that are also targeting the canola acres, things like Horsch, Case has planters, John Deere has their own planters as well. We chose to go with Monosem for a number of good reasons. We've got a good local dealer here who knows planters really well and provided us with a lot of expertise at Kirchner Machine there, and that helped to develop this plot seeder here. So this particular plot seeder, we're actually able to do zero tillage and one pass seeding operations. The big white tanks in the back are for granular fertilizer, so we've got a side banding separate disc opener that puts down our nitrogen, and then we have a liquid kit where we're dribbling down either 1034 or something like that as far as the phosphorus seed row place. So we've got a one pass seeding operation for that planter, and we wanted to compare it to a traditional air drill. So our air drill seeder behind me is set up to mimic a field scale air drill. In this case, we have pillar laser openers, and we did that on 12-inch row spacing. So we wanted to compare actually the Monosem on 12-inch row spacing, because previous experience that we've seen, and a lot of the folks that I mentioned before who were planting with planters were doing it on a 20 to 22-inch row spacing, which is typical for dry beans. So when we looked at those crops, and yes, they do plant at wide rows in other places like Australia is even as wide as 30-inch rows, but we saw that there's not a really great opportunity for the crop to canopy over well, and it doesn't ever fill that gap. So that seemed like an issue to us, and we wanted to see, well, what if we just narrowed up a planter? So then we've got the benefits that the planter provides, but also on a row spacing that has been proven to be more efficient here in southern Alberta and in all of Alberta. We have really fast growing season, so canopy closure and fast growth in this growing season is really important. So narrower row spacing was something that we wanted to look at that's really never previously been looked at. I also learned that companies like previously Monsanto and now Bayer, they have been using an air planter system for their plot research. So they've got a planter set up that has movable rows so they can do both their corn and canola. Was really impressed with just how good of a job these planters were doing. So that is exactly why we're interested in planters. So the planter technology really does have superior depth control, and it also has superior placement of the seed along a seed row. So if we actually end up looking at the plots, you'll be able to see a very, very precise and very even application of that seed along a seed row. Whereas with an air drill, you still have that roller that is not precise. So it's kind of a controlled spill. A lot of people like to describe an air drill. So then you have periodic gaps in your rows depending on your seeding rate and soil conditions when you're seeding. And you can also have issues with depth control. And with canola, when we're trying to plant really for us around a ½ an inch depth, the planter has a depth control right exactly where the seed is coming out. Where often in air drills, that depth control is the packer wheel that's about 2 or 3 feet behind the planter. So it doesn't necessarily follow the contours of the land. There are, of course, newer seeders that have better depth control, and we're seeing improvements in canola establishment. We've often heard establishment in canola, we're lucky to get 50% emergence. And our trials, on average, we were in between around 40 and 50% emergence in the majority of our treatments. So even in the best of times, we were still not able to get a great emergence. And one thing that we did see for sure was that as we increase our seeding rate, our percent emergence goes down. So there's more inter-row competition. And if we want to get those germination rates up like we do with other crops, I think it's just a challenging thing to do unless we go to narrower rows. But the reality is the more seeds we put down in that row, it's going to drive down your emergence. So we did a 4-year study, both in irrigated and dry land here in Lethbridge and in Medicine Hat. So we've got 12 site years of data. And the general findings, which I was really quite excited about, was that under irrigation and high rainfall effects, or high rainfall environments, we saw an average yield increase of about 8.3 bushels per acre. So at $11 canola, that's $91 per acre return. And that's something that's pretty exciting. That's a big improvement if we could apply that over broad acres. Now, a lot of folks went to planters originally thinking that it was a method for saving seed costs. Yes, we know hybrid seed canola is an expensive seed, so if we can save seed costs, that's great. I think we have a potential to save seeds with planters, but the majority of our results actually showed that as we increase our seeding rates, we're still getting a better response on yield, even with the planter. So that whole idea of going to planters to save seed, I don't think is the main driver. I'm excited as the driver should be a more even emergence, increased yield, less green seed, and an overall just more resilient crop. So, and our demo that we put together this year actually shows everything that we've seen in the last number of years, plus a couple of other things. Well, since nobody's here, I can just throw stuff. So here's a quick plot shot, or a quick graph of our emergence. And what I mentioned before, as we increase seeding rates, we did the study with a number of seeding rates from 20, 40, 60, 80, and 160 seeds per meter squared. So depending on the seed size, that ranged from less than a pound per acre up to about 6 pounds per acre. Normally, I'd say average is in that 80 to 100 seeds per meter squared as recommended. But as we increase our seeding rate, our percent emergence generally trends down. The green bar is the ones with the A's here. That's our planter on 12 inches. So we always saw an improvement on emergence with the planter over the air drill. In fact, it was about, on average, 1.5 times greater emergence for using the planter versus the air drill. So that's not insignificant. And folks, if you guys have questions, please maybe send them in the chat box and Jamie will shout them out to me, because I'd rather have a conversation while I'm doing this rather than just giving you a talk. So please don't be shy. I like this, just throwing the papers on the ground. So when we look at our yields, as we increase the seeding rate, as I mentioned before, generally the trend is to go up. The biggest finding that we didn't really expect was the planter on 20-inch rows was inferior to both the air drill and the Monosem on 12-inch row spacing. So that row spacing piece is really important. Jamie?
Was there any difference in flea beetle control when using reduced seeding rates?
So the question was there a difference in flea beetle control? So for the most part of this study, we haven't had a significant flea beetle pressure, but ironically, I appreciate the question. This year in the demonstration that we'll talk about after I've gone through the results of our previous study, our lower seeding rate this year just looks like garbage. And I think there's two factors that really affected it, and it was flea beetles and wind. So I'll come back to that a little bit later when I'm touring through the plots, but this year I think is the first time we've seen that as a factor, but in the previous 4, it wasn't for us. Usually in southern Alberta, we haven't had the same issue with flea beetles as other parts of the country. And I think that as long as we get things established quickly, the crop's growing out of it, and the need to spray hasn't been all that high. So back to my yield chart, this is the average of everything. When we average everything out, the air drill did actually perform statistically equivalent to the planter on 12, but there were some differences. I mentioned the high yielding irrigated side of things. That's where we saw the yield advantage, but we also had 3 years of drought to consider. Our irrigated location was statistically significant better yield, so that here in Lethbridge, and our dryland in Medicine Hat over the 4 years was higher yielding. All right. So this is just the last chart I'll show you on this video, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the next steps. The irrigated study, obviously we had just a way awesome response to irrigation given our drought. So the overall yield on the irrigation, we were pushing in that 80 to 90 bushel per acre range, and really significant improvements between the seeding rates. So our best seeding rate would be in between that 60 and 80 economically. Statistically not different between the 60 and 40 rate. So that's actually getting pretty low seeding rates, meaning that despite the fact that we're having a poor level of emergence, we're still getting a good enough, even enough plant stand to realize that yield potential. Now I think I threw away one of my sheets that I didn't want to, but we're gonna go take a quick look at some of the strip till machine and describe how we're gonna integrate all of this. Am I too far away? Okay, so I mentioned that planters were first really developed and used in the major corn, soybean belts in the US. Now, in that case, the majority of the crops was conventionally tilled, and they always saw an advantage to yield in that corn and soybean belt for tillage. But as the sort of conservation tillage movement began in the sort of late 80s and early 90s, there was a desire to sort of, how do you blend the best of the two environments? So there are studies that have found that strip tillage is a really good opportunity to get the best of both worlds. So beside me is a small plot tillage or strip tillage machine. The principle there is that you're only tilling a small band that matches up with the planter. Yes? So there was a question on a difference between
with field scale equipment.
Okay, difference between harvestability using a planter on or versus an air drill, I think is the question. So I didn't mention this yet. So what's that?
Field scale.
I didn't mention this yet, but we do actually have a field scale study that is continuing the best treatments that we've found in this planter study. So we don't have all of those answers yet, but we are looking at sort of the next level of how does this work out in the real world in a field scale scenario. My own sort of anecdotal experience is that at times there have been issues with canola on planters when it's too wide, and then sometimes the swaths will fall between the stubble and it doesn't stay in place. But otherwise, I haven't heard any issues, especially when you move to a 15-inch row spacing. But stay tuned. Louis Barta is conducting the field scale project on that side, and we'll learn more over the next couple of years. So back to this strip till machine. So strip till, the idea is in the fall, preferably, you can go in and prepare the land essentially where you're going to be going over the planter in the spring. There's a second option there that a lot of folks in the US are doing is they'll combine the strip tillage machine with the fertilizer applicator. So then they can deep band in nutrients. So whether it be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, so you can put your band your fertilizer down, and then the next spring you'll have the planter that can go into that already sort of worked area, creates a nice berm, protects the seedlings, and can even help attract water into that furrow. So there's been a lot of research done on strip tillage in corn. It's proven to increase soil temperature. So in places like Canada, where we have cool springs and such, this would be sort of a nice idea in dealing with a lot of residue issues that can cause problems for emergence in canola. It can also help increase the soil temperature that will help encourage a faster, more even emergence, and also protect it from frost damage. So the next stage, because we're also studying this deep banding idea in another study where we put, say, 3 years worth of your immobile nutrients like phosphorus and potassium down, and then you're saving time and you're sort of trying to minimize the tillage, because I was raised in the zero tillage zone, so I'm not a big fan of tillage, but we have seen instances, and even in our own deep banding study, where there's been an advantage to a strip till. Sometimes it helps bring moisture up and also encourages root development for the plant. So I have to try to be objective and look at the best of both worlds. So we're seeing some slight advantages in certain situations with our deep banding project. And this is an opportunity to actually combine sort of the best results of two different trials. And funny enough, this plot right here in front of me is our monosem planter on 12-inch row spacings. This trial here we seeded on May 7th, so not the earliest, but we've had a pretty darn windy and cool spring. We started off pretty dry, and when we walk through these plots, this is actually the winner of all the treatments. And that's kind of interesting to me. So kind of excited about the potential. A lot of times when we study things, we'll have a little win here, a little win there. We start putting those together, they can make a big difference. So the demo now that we're doing is exactly that. We've picked two seeding rates, 40 seeds per meter squared and 80 seeds per meter squared. What that ends up being is almost exactly 2 pounds per acre and 4 pounds per acre. So we mentioned before the question on flea beetles. You can see even right beside me, maybe at this plot over here, how significant difference there is between these two plots. So I don't even have to look at that, but I'm pretty sure this is a 40 seeds per acre rate. And I think actually the reason we're seeing that is a combination of issues. I think it was flea beetle issues, and I also think that the wind shear this year has been really significant. In fact, I've been told by pollinators that a number of their seed canola fields have had to be reseeded because of poor emergence. So it's been a bit of a rough year on canola. And all of these treatments along this trial were planted the exact same day, but amazing differences just on how it's planted. So agronomy makes a really big difference as far as establishing a good solid canola crop. Okay, so there's a couple of other factors within this trial. The two seeding rates, the 2 pounds and the 4 pounds. We've also done strip tillage and no strip tillage. We've done it the same as the previous study that I talked about with the air drill on 12-inch row spacing and the monosem here, both on 12 and 20-inch row spacing. Actually, the strip till machine that we have behind us, we can move it around, but we weren't able to squeeze it tight enough for 12-inch row spacing. So we actually moved it to 24-inch and then went over it twice. Really not ideal. Obviously we offset by 12 inches to get that narrow band. However, it's currently set up on a 15-inch row spacing, which is sort of the commercially acceptable planter that's being sold and developed right now. So we'd like to look at the 15-inch row spacing with the monosem at 15, and then play around with the strip till versus no strip till, and then different fertilizer systems. And that way we'll have a better idea of, can we combine the best of what we found in these other studies and try to optimize our canola yield. So I mentioned it was seeded May 7th. We've tried to keep nutrients a non-limiting factor, so we actually have lots of nitrogen added, 120 pounds of nitrogen, about 50 pounds of phosphorus with the seed. And yeah, that's what we have. So maybe we'll take a look at the plots. If you guys have questions again, please just shout them out, or I should say, type them out, and Jamie will ask me. So we're going to start back at the front here. No questions even from John? Okay. Okay, so this first plot here, this is a 20-inch row spacing at 40 seeds. Now, the last 4 years of the study, we never saw the low seeding rate look this bad. So I think this is a bit of a reflection of the conditions that we had this spring. We also had issues with our planter this year. The planter, to be able to get to those very narrow row spacing, actually has an extension placed on it so that we can still get the effect of residue clearance. Now, as we're moving this row spacing and adjusting the hydraulics, one of our openers either didn't get bolted on exactly the same way, but we had a very, very, very slight difference in depth control with one of those openers, and it shows up in our plots. only some of the time. So I think what happened, and I think a lot of folks are seeing this, is basically a split emergence with their canola given the dry conditions. And I think what happens there is you're just on the boundary of getting that seed to the moisture. So the first set of seed that's in the moisture germinates, then a shower comes in, and then the next seed that was just slightly above that will germinate. So we're seeing a fair bit of split emergence in canola fields because of that reason. I think we have a question.
Yeah, 100 pounds and actual, what was the total available right now?
So I added the question was about the fertility. We added 120 pounds of actual, and the background would have been around 30 to 40 pounds. So we're pushing 200 pounds of nitrogen, and we also found in our previous study that to hit under the irrigated side, if we want to hit maximum yields, we had to be getting upwards into that 60 pounds of phosphorus. So a little bit higher phosphorus than we're used to, but remember we're actually getting close to that 90 bushel range. So it's pretty high fertility. So back to the plots here, we've got really kind of an ugly plot. This is the 20-inch row spacing. Michael Gretzinger, our field coordinator, we had the staff actually go through and look at the plant stand for this trial, and we also did a canopy closure measurement. So there's a nice little app that you can download called Canopio, not sure how to pronounce it, but talking with Dr. Charles Geddes, he's using this in his herbicide studies, literally puts the phone on a selfie stick on a tripod and then takes canopy closures. It seems really simple, but it's actually a fantastic tool for looking at canopy closure. And that's why I'm so interested in this demo plot too, because we're June 25th today. We're 4 days after the June solstice. And a good friend, mentor of mine, always said that what we're looking for in every growing condition here in Alberta is to try to get canopy closure by the June solstice, because we've got a crop that is basically a solar panel. If we can cover that ground, then we're maximizing the solar interception and the ability to produce yield. So that's why the first plot that I was showing you almost got full canopy closure with the Monosem planter 12-inch. But when you look at a 20-inch row spacing here with some opener issues, we're lucky if we've got 20 or 30% canopy closure. So I'm just going to pull up actually the results of that. Start throwing more papers around. We also did the plant stand. So I'm not sure which camera for this one. So here's the results of our plant stands on all of this. And you know, if you let your eyes wander, you'll immediately go over here. Here's the two highest plant stands. I might have to pull that out. So sulfur fertility, we often will not add any sulfur because this is an irrigated study here. We've got high levels of sulfur in the irrigation that usually will make more than enough for what we're doing here. If we were dry land, sometimes we might add sulfur, but often we're not getting any response from sulfur here. So the Monosem 12-inch row spacing, really clear winners as far as plant stand establishment in this one demo trial. So the strip tillage showed a little bit of an advantage on that treatment, but for the most part, not a huge advantage. So I'm not sure if the strip tillage is actually going to play a big role as far as stand establishment, but you never know. We do see some small numeric differences in the strip tillage, providing a numeric advantage, but if we get another project looking at this, then we'll have a better idea. So you'll see anything that's been seeded with the 40 seeds, really quite low plant stand. So that's 30 seeds per meter squared, and that's not ideal. You have 3 plants per square foot. We'd like to see it probably above 4. There's really only one treatment that's made that, and that's our Monosem, both no-till and strip-till. So I found that's pretty interesting. Pretty big advantage on the lower seeding rate, so on this particular treatment with the Monosem 20. The other thing that we've noticed in looking at this trial, and I'm not sure again if this is sort of because of the growing season that we've had this spring, but as we move to a wider row spacing, obviously we get more seeds in the row. And whenever we have more seeds in the row, that interplant competition does actually create a vigor advantage. So the plants are growing more vigorously. And I actually had the two nice camera ladies look through these plots yesterday and asked them to pick out their favorite looking plot. And they did pick the 20-inch row spacing with strip tillage at 80 seeds per meter squared. And you can see that they're really robust plants, but they didn't quite canopy over like our 12-inch row spacing. So once I manipulated their minds into thinking the 12-inch was better, they agreed with me, right? Yeah. So let's move along and we'll look at some of the treatments. And you can see within the plots here too, we've got big mats of residue. So the residue right here is all matted down from the cereals. And in this particular case, I can usually pick out without having to look at the signs which ones had the strip tillage. So the one advantage of the strip tillage is moving that residue in between the rows. So right here, I'm not sure if you can see that from here, but there's an issue with emergence. There's a reduction in growth. Sometimes that could be spring frost. It could be just that didn't have the right seed to soil contact and able to get good emergence. So let me see, which plot am I on here? So this is the 80 seeds per meter squared with the air drill. That's what I'm saying. It's not a bad looking plot, but we've got some variation wherever we have residue. Now I'm thinking I'm moving to a planter right here. So this is the planter zero till. Looks pretty darn good. I think it also, the other thing to mention that with our planter, which probably is maybe a little unfair advantage, we have residue managers on our planter already. So you can adapt these planters to be zero till and try to have the same benefits of doing strip tillage. So I think that actually did make a difference. That contouring of that opener also made a big difference. So when we have these big residue matches here, and that's from last year's combine strips, we're not seeing that same significant drop in the height and in the plant stand. So overall, a much more even crop. When you go across here, we're back to that low seeding rate now. And whenever we have this big residue mat, we're having really spotty emergence, and it's not really ideal. And right next to us again is the monosem strip tillage. And I think it's even slightly better than the zero till. Without those residue managers though, I think we'd see a bigger difference. Any questions from the crowd right now as I move? Come on, Rick, you can ask one too if you want. I know you're listening. So let's take a look at some of the other plots, and we'll wrap up the session with hopefully a little bit more discussion, and otherwise we'll move on. So here's the monosem at 40. And now we got ourselves into a really bad residue mat in the front of the plots here where we've got nothing. But you can see that there's no comparison to that higher seeding rate. So this is a little bit of an anomaly that I'm not used to seeing. And I think I did mention before that I think a lot of this could have been flea beetle related. Just that lower seeding rate didn't have that same competitive advantage. I also think that there was something to that vigor of having more plants within the seed row this year that was able to just take off. So I thought that was pretty interesting. As we move back here again, you've got this big residue mat, and I can look down the side here and I can probably pick out which had strip till and which didn't. So the question was around heavy harrowing compared to strip tillage. So as far as residue management, heavy harrowing is a great option. And I think that overall, despite what we're studying here, as far as even emergence, that management of straw is a critical piece that we're still struggling with for the ground part. So I'm not sure that heavy harrowing would compare. What it does is even things out so that you don't get these mat type issues. But it doesn't do the same thing as strip tillage, which is literally, it's a shank that goes through the soil. So you're actually doing tillage within that band, and it loosens up not just the soil on top, but at depth, so that moisture can come up from below, that your roots are unimpeded and can go down quicker and access moisture and nutrients. So, it's a really fair comment that I think we do need to be paying attention to, not just heavy harrowing, but the types of choppers and spreaders behind combines, whether you're doing it in wind and how heavy residue there is. But that is still an area that I think is something that we need to be considering to try to get those more even crops, because I think that makes a really big difference in the long run. So as we're moving along here, I just wanted to take you down here to the plot that I think is second best. Maybe right here we're on the 20-inch rows. I can tell without the strip tillage. So this is a better fair comparison because we didn't have to go over it twice with the strip tillage machine. But right in here where we see this big residue mat, even the planter couldn't manage to get through that. So yes, a heavy harrow on this would have helped. We did heavy harrow, but it didn't obviously do the job. We had an irrigated wheat crop here that was quite heavy last year. But as we move to the very last plot down here, we do not have that same issue with this residue. So this is a really good example of where that strip till machine actually improved that seed to soil contact and came up with a pretty decent crop. So as far as the 20-inch row spacing ability this year, it does look pretty good, but I guarantee that the 12-inch row spacing will out yield everything. So I think that 15-inch, to sum it up, that 15-inch row spacing is probably a nice compromise. I'm more of a fan of the 12-inch. It's not that common. There are a few guys out there that actually do have a 12-inch planter, but it's very rare. The reason I like that idea is that now you can consider doing other crops with that same planter. I don't like going any wider than 12 inch. There's been a lot of research over the years that have shown the narrow rows. I think we've made a compromise when we went to zero till. We went to wider row spacing. Before that, 7-inch and 6-inch, 5-inch row spacing was pretty common under conventional. So I think we made a compromise going wider, but the benefits of zero tillage, what it did for soil quality and health and moisture retention, it sort of outweighed the loss that we did to wider rows. So I'm a little bit skeptical in moving too wide. So if we move to, say, a planter, can you do other crops? And we did just start a study, and we'll talk about at one of our next crop walks, is how do other crops like wheat and peas and barley and all the other pulses perform with a planter versus an air drill. So I kind of like that idea of the 12-inch, although it does provide some cost issues, residue management issues, things like that. So the logistics side of things just isn't quite there yet with planters. But I still see that there's a strong interest, a strong growing demand for improved crop establishment. And when you start adding these little agronomic differences together, you start to see really big benefits in the crop. So that is my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. And if there aren't, thank you so much. We hope that you can come and see us in the field soon. Our next crop walk is our field school on July 9th, and we're taking all the safety precautions necessary to keep you safe, and we look forward to seeing you then. Take care.